Okay, looks like I'm live. So today I'm smoking a brisket for a church function, and I figured, hey, I've got an hour between times that I got to throw another log on the fire to put the smoke in the meat. So might as well read some In Darkness Cast because it's the perfect brisket smoking novel, right? So you may hear children in the background. Three of them went to a rodeo today, but the 2-year-old is still with my wife, so I think she's taking a bath right now. I don't know if you can hear her. She'll probably be singing in the bathtub, so nice little background soundtrack to just fit the vibe. You know, that vibe. All right, so last time we finished up chapter 2, Ashkelon had just killed Gideon for the first time, and we'll keep going. All right. Chapter 3 Basic. According to the ancient scriptures, hidden away by the Signivencium Church and known only by rumor, the everlasting dark ruled the cosmos first. Within its realm, vast storms of night crawled across space, blacker than the void itself, hiding monstrous leviathans of unfathomable hunger. By their power, chaos was sustained, and life could not take hold. Then, at the command of the Almighty, light burst forth across the savage domain, driving back the void dragons and establishing an oasis free of the claws of the dark. Within this harbor, God planted a garden. He formed man and woman of the dust of the ground, carefully shaping each and every part into a being in his image. His final act was to breathe into his creation the breath of life, conferring upon humanity its eternal soul. Breath. I need more of it. The thought flicked through Gideon's mind as he staggered backward, sinking to one knee. His mind screamed at his lungs, ordering them to fill themselves with oxygen, but they could not obey. His new master's mailed fist saw to that. Ashkelon crouched in front of Gideon and slapped him lightly on one cheek. Focus. Understand what you are feeling. Comprehend it. Measure it. His icy eyes narrowed. Now get past it, and never fail again. Air. I need air. Familiar blackness invaded the corners of his vision as Gideon's body heaved at the motionless air, trying to overcome the invisible death gripping his lungs in rigid stasis. A backhanded slap lit Gideon's face on fire with its force. Do you think that your enemy will have compassion on you? An iron boot thudded into Gideon's flank, but he managed to lurch to the side, robbing it of much of its force. A bite of air seeped into his lungs, flushing his blood with new strength. Ashkelon kicked again, and Gideon managed to sweep his forearm at it, knocking it away. There, you bitter old man. I blocked it. The sorcerer's boot did not come to rest. Instead, it slashed back in a blistering hook kick that Gideon did not block. Gideon came to learn over the course of several weeks that mercy did not rank among the virtues of Ashkelon. Actually, Gideon remained unsure if there were any virtues of Ashkelon, unless cruelty, ferocity, and ruthless discipline could be counted as such. In those terrible months, Gideon suffered more than he had in his entire life. Every waking moment was spent fending off savage assaults, launched without notice or provocation. Ashkelon would attack him when he slept, when he ate, when he relieved himself in the forest, and he was not permitted to fail. Ashkelon's fiery blue eyes locked with Gideon's as he loomed over him, snapping, Your focus is slipping. React with the appropriate counter next time. Gideon groaned from his prone position on the ground. You did the wrong strike. Not the one you were teaching me. Ashkelon barked a sardonic laugh. You think this is a dance, where each partner will act at the appropriate time as expected. Shall I delicately clasp your hand while whispering sweet nothings into your ear? Anger flared in Gideon's breast at the mockery. but he swallowed it, knowing it to be pride. No, master. Ashkelon's eyes burned with intensity. Combat is not a dance. We do not take turns, and we do not fight as expected by our enemies. We fight without pattern. We snap bone, rupture organs, and tear out throats. We do anything necessary to kill our enemies and strike fear into their allies, because death incites terror. Terror produces hesitation. Hesitation means weakness. Weakness, Gideon took a deep breath, calming himself, invites death, master. Now get up and do something unexpected for me for once, such as countering adequately. He did not. All right, I need to work on Ashkelon's voice a little bit. I think I need to try for Hugo Weaving. I think I like that one better. Has more personality. I just had to set my brain to that. All right, let's see if I can do it now. Adding to his misery, Gideon was forced to provide for his own needs. He scraped roots out of the ground with filthy fingers, built his fires out of scattered brush and fallen limbs, and even resorted to wolfing down the grubs beneath fallen logs. Once, Ashkelon allowed him to hunt. In his former life, Gideon had relished the quiet and isolation of hunting. He found nature soothing, away from the noise of people, and he had spent many hours alone with his thoughts as he prayed and meditated upon the legacy of Armand Halcyon. When Ashkelon offered the opportunity, Gideon leapt at the chance. It proved a mistake. The silence of the forest provided some respite from the sorcerer's acidic presence. Gideon sighted down his arrow at the doe grazing in the thicket, slowly closing one eye, waiting for the perfect second to release. A harsh voice hissed in his ear. Close that eye again, and the crows will feast upon it tonight. Gideon jerked reflexively, firing the arrow wildly as the shadow stalking him from his blind side reached for him. As Ashkelon slammed him into the tree to punish him for his trespass, Gideon glimpsed the doe fleeing into the woods. That night, he sat shivering by a weak fire, forbidden to sleep till he had crafted a quiver of arrows to replace the single shot wasted. As his chilled fingers fumbled over the shafts, Gideon thought back to that deer, and despite his situation, flashed a brief, fatalistic smile. Keep running, he willed the beast. Keep running. The suffering Gideon endured at Ashkelon's hands was not the worst part of his ordeal. None of the beatings, deprivations, scorn, or punishments could match the true horror of what the sorcerer did to him. The most awful part of his training occurred whenever Gideon failed, and Ashkelon killed him. Gideon's fingers slipped as they clutched at the hilt of the sword jutting from his chest. They were slick with red blood, a deep crimson, life-giving crimson. His, both the blood and the blade. He collapsed to his knees, still clutching at the Halcyon family sword, levering his ribs open with every shuddering breath. His graying vision lifted to see a nightmare striding toward him, hand lowering from a blade cast. Ashkelon gripped the handle of the sword and kicked Gideon in the chest, jerking it a full forearm's length out of his body. With a quick flick and twist, Ashkelon cleaned the blade of Gideon's blood, spattering his fallen body with a hot rain. The dark mage clenched his fist, his blue eyes cold, and Gideon gave a hoarse gasp as the lips of the chasm cut into his chest pulled. If breath had been available, he would have screamed in indescribable agony as his organs sewed themselves back together inside of his body, obeying the sorceress imperative compelling them to function once again. Bones and skin reformed, choosing to rebel against nature rather than Ashkelon's cruel will. And the crimson pouring from his chest reversed its course, fleeing back into his veins. With a final wrenching spasm of bone reknitting, Gideon's wound closed, and air flooded his lungs. As he gasped on the ground, Ashkelon's dark voice invaded his consciousness. Your failure is not its own punishment. When you fail, those you profess to protect suffer as well. If you fall in battle, hell will advance over your corpse and tear into the weak behind you. Their screams would be the final sound, to accompany your failed soul to the halls of the after. And so you taste of this black chalice. You will sup at the table of the doomed, that you may know the fate of those you would fail. I will bring you back from the threshold of the dark of death, until such time as I determine you have no further value. At that time, my apprentice, you may die. He was tired. No, exhausted. Reduced to a worthless scrap of humanity by the horrors inflicted on him. Gideon was sleep deprived and malnourished, nerves forever on edge lest the psychopathic sadist catch him off guard again. If Gideon failed, Ashkelon beat him to death, burned him, speared him, drowned him, shot, strangled, stabbed, exploded, exsanguinated, eviscerated, and decapitated him. He was boiled alive, pulled apart, crushed, and poisoned. Failure! He died every day for weeks. He endured the soul sickening tumble into death dozens of times from sunrise to sunset. And at night, it was worse. Ashkelon murdered him in his sleep without provocation, sliding a knife into his throat simply because he could. Failure! Gideon died on his knees, on his feet, on his back, his stomach, face, and side. His body thudded into the dirt with a crash of mangled armor over and over again. Each time, Ashkelon snarled the same word as Gideon fell into the blackness of death. Failure! On the morning of the 80th day, as the sun broke above the tree line on the Ironback Mountains, Gideon snapped. Ashkelon was delivering one of his dark sermons as Gideon performed push ups in the tatters of his abused armor on jagged rocks. His palms were slashed and bleeding from the serrated stone as the sorcerer's voice droned on. Banish the thought of pain. Refuse to allow its dominion over your mind. Pain paralyzes. Paralysis is weakness. And weakness? Ashkelon held up a finger, one elegant eyebrow arched in a gesture of mild contempt, as he awaited his pupil's inevitable response. Gideon threw his sword. He was not even aware of the decision to do so. His hand whipped to the scabbard mounted on his back. The blade rasped as it escaped the sheath, and Gideon roared as he rocked back on his knees and hurled the halcyon blade with both hands at the source of his torment. Ashkelon's eyes widened in surprise as the shining sword sliced through the air toward his chest. He slapped the keen edge aside just before it skewered him where he stood, and the blade sparked as it skittered over the razor-sharp stones. You seem angry. Gideon's boots pounded the earth, tossing flecks of stone as he charged, shoulder lowered and mouth open in a wordless bellow of hate. He tackled Ashkelon clean off of his feet, the smaller mage grunting at the impact of Gideon's mass. His master landed on his back, with Gideon already rocketing a bleeding fist at his head, like a boulder from a trebuchet. Just before Gideon creamed Ashkelon's sharp features, just before glorious satisfaction flooded his veins, darkness exploded around him, and his fist pounded into soft dirt. Not Ashkelon's smug face. Not even something that made a satisfying sound, like wood or stone. The faint piff of punching dirt. Gideon turned to glare at Ashkelon standing a few yards away, nonchalantly dusting himself off, and he howled in frustration. Ashkelon glanced at him and smiled, an arrogant smirk that only infuriated Gideon more. Gideon stabbed his finger at him and screamed again, his entire body rigid and shaking as he channeled all the hate, rage, and pain of the past weeks into a single primal bellow directed at one man. He'd be speaking with a rasp for days, but he did not care. The roar lasted for a few seconds, while Ashkelon waited patiently for the noise to stop. It did eventually, trailing off pitifully as Gideon's lungs failed to continue projecting his discontent at Ashkelon. Ashkelon spread his hands and opened his mouth, but Gideon snarled at him. No! Shut up! Shut up! I don't care. I don't want to hear it. Ashkelon furrowed his brow and repeated. You appear to be upset. Upset? You have starved me, robbed me, beaten me, deprived me of sleep, and killed me, and you think I'm upset? Those things make you angry. Gideon actually struggled to articulate a response to this level of density. Yes, yes, Ashkelon, yes. Those things make me angry. Enraged, actually. Ashkelon considered him. And you want to stop those things? Gideon stared at him for a moment, hands planted on his hips, chest heaving. Yes, of course I do, you maniac. Who wouldn't? Would you stop them from happening to someone else? Gideon paused. Why are you asking me that? Of course I would. Ashkelon nodded once, briskly. Walk with me. He turned and walked away, his dark mail cloak whipping behind him. Gideon followed behind, a terrible idea curling up in his gut that Ashkelon knew exactly when he would break. Tilting his head, Gideon could just make out a woman's scream over the wind. Staggering up a short hill, he crested the top to see a settler's covered wagon on the road. Bandits surrounded it, tearing women and children from each other's arms. Two men shouted hoarsely, brandishing makeshift tools as weapons. They already bled as the robbers laughed. Gideon's heart pounded as his gaze flashed back and forth across the scene. At his side, Ashkelon folded his arms and said, Without a doubt, the males will be killed, and the women kept alive for as much sport as they can provide. If the children survive to reach the market, they will be sold as slaves to the highest bidder, who will use them as they see appropriate. Gideon's breathing pattern accelerated, and he glanced from Ashkelon to the scene before them. Ashkelon gestured almost wearily. I give you permission to save them from this fate. Gideon hesitated, watching for the trap. He took a step forward and froze immediately when Ashkelon spoke again. Or? Ashkelon clenched his fist, and black smoke pooled in the air around his hand. I can command that these stones be made bread. The aroma of hot bread, fresh from the baker's hearth, flooded Gideon's senses an instant before his eyes beheld the reality. A board, groaning over the most delicious supper Gideon had ever seen, unfolded itself for him at Ashkelon's feet. A large turkey leg dripped its rich juices onto a plate crowded with roasted potatoes. A flagon of water stood by a twin flagon of wine, and a fluffy pastry filled with baked apples and cinnamon sagged under heavy cream. Gideon's mind blanked. His mouth flooded with saliva, and his instincts roared at him to ignore the screams, ignore everything, and dive into the succulent banquet awaiting him. A low groan escaped him before he could bite it back. Emotionless, arms crossed, Ashkelon was neutral. You may either try to save them or satisfy your hunger. You have time for one choice. Go to. You deserve it. People die every day. Ashkelon watched him carefully, as Gideon seemed frozen for a split second. You need your strength. What good are you without food, anyways? What good are you? Gideon's fist clenched. Where's my sword? The words choked out of his dry throat. Ashkelon cocked his head. Again? I could not hear you. Gideon looked at him, away from the food he so desperately needed, opened his palm and said it again. Sword. With a slash of purplish black, Ashkelon pulled the gleaming halcyon sword from a rent in the air. He held it out to Gideon, then set it on the small banquet table. He stepped back, face impassive. Gideon walked forward and gripped the handle of his sword. He did not spare the food a second thought, because hesitation means weakness. Ashkelon raised an eyebrow and asked, Nothing? Not even an apple for the fight? Gideon's eyes were cold and hard as he lifted his sword and stared down the blade at the carnage beneath him. I have what I need. The first bandit was still laughing when a lance of iron ripped through his chest and tore his heart open. The second turned at the sound of his comrade's body hitting the ground. He, at least, saw his killer. The third dropped the woman struggling in his arms and actually got his own sword up before Gideon's blade hammered into him, knocking him backward. Gideon did not stop moving. He barreled forward and rammed his blade through the brigand's chest, twisting and jerking it back, even as he spun to cut again at the enemy nearest him, who was only just turning to meet the threat. The flat of Gideon's blade slapped the man across the face, spilling him to the ground. Two more rushed him, weapons raised. As they pounded toward him, Gideon felt the training of the past weeks take control of him. His concentration divided, almost as if there were now two Gideons. One lived in the eternity of a single second, dispassionate, detached, noting each vulnerability in turn, and selecting the appropriate strikes to expend the least energy while reaping the maximum benefit. The other felt time rage around him like a hurricane. He fought in a whirlwind of ringing steel and roaring heartbeats, never stopping, never relenting, because weakness invites death. The resulting gestalt was a Gideon who could see every weakness of his foes and gloried in exploiting them. The bandits had no concept of what they faced. His sword deflected both incoming strikes. Okay. His sword deflected both incoming strikes and slammed into the chest of the first before tearing back out to slash the throat of the other. The bodies had yet to impact the ground before he angled himself for the charge of their companions. The thugs shouted in anger, brandishing their weapons in threat as they rushed him. Gideon barely noticed them. His mind had already processed the deaths of the first three and worked on the remnant when their blades reached him. Every capacity for hesitation had been squeezed out of him over the past weeks of torture. All softness, all inefficiency, all weakness. Ashkelon's brutal lessons took hold, and suddenly the bandits' own hesitation was glaringly apparent. Wasted movements, sloppy guards, lazy openings. Every mistake Gideon himself had made and paid for in life's blood. Ashkelon's words echoed in his thoughts. All I see is weakness. He caught a blade on his vambrace and slapped it aside, ramming his fist into the man's face. With Gideon's size behind it, it likely fractured the man's skull as it pitched him backward. The bandit's eyes widened, and Gideon charged. Gideon flitted between fallen blades like a dancer. He did not even feel like he was hurrying, as he crunched a foot into a bandit's groin while simultaneously arcing his blade to hamstring the man's companion trying to flank him. His sword flashed back and ended both men in a series of looping cuts. For a brief instant, he caught sight of the wide-eyed gazes of the settlers as he deflected a blade over his head and crushed the bearer's throat with a spear hand. They watched, open-mouthed, as he fought an entire gang of reavers, spilling their bodies across the road. How am I doing this? He caught sight of Ashkelon standing on the hill, arms crossed. He watched his student execute his training. What did you do to me? Gideon thrust and slashed, his halcyon blade weaving an impenetrable web of iron before him. The bodies of the slain tumbled away, slumping across one another in death, till there remained only one. The final bandit swung his axe wildly, his eyes wide with horror. Gideon sidestepped the attack with a terrible calm and slammed his elbows into the man's chest, pitching the man off his feet even as Gideon reversed the grip on his blade and rammed it into his spine. Gideon's lungs pumped like a forge's bellows, his blood pounding in his head. His body struggled to meet the punishing demands Gideon had placed on it. His vision blurred, and he found it difficult to remain standing. He was weak, drained, and ravenously hungry. But still he stood, and he had not failed. An hour later, the grateful family departed, their strength restored by Gideon's abandoned feast. Drink. In case you're wondering, today's reading is brought to you by Organic Strawberry Lemonade. Ashkelon came to stand beside him as he stood with his arms crossed, sword cleaned and sheathed on his back, watching the survivors dwindle into the distance, considering his decisions. Ashkelon broke the silence. How do you feel? Hungry, Gideon answered honestly, grimacing at the rumbles in his gut. But somehow full. Really. Gideon turned to glare at him. Man shall not live by bread alone, the scriptures say. Ashkelon said nothing to that, but offered him a pouch. Gideon hesitated, but his hunger forced him to accept the bag. It contains 2 small loaves of brown bread, several strips of dried meat, and a large apple. As Gideon registered the surprising contents, Ashkelon held out a water skin. Gideon blinked several times with the unexpected kindness, trying to force the stinging in his eyes back. After the endless cruelty and hatred, this simple gift put him on the edge of an emotional breakdown. He had to take a number of deep breaths to control himself, hating himself for being so weak in front of Ashkelon. Ashkelon glanced away, giving his student his space. Sit and eat slowly. The fruit first. It will satisfy your immediate need for strength. It was not a feast. It was barely even a meal, but it is enough. Without a word, Gideon obeyed. Regarding him as he ate, Ashkelon spoke. You have passed the first test. Gideon glanced up from his meal. The sorcerer continued. You have sacrificed your satisfaction of your basic needs to provide them to complete strangers. Starving, exhausted, and abused, you overcame temptation in order to thrust yourself into a dangerous situation where you were outnumbered, and you triumphed. Out of all the men I have seen on this world, you are the first to deny his own needs for others. Gideon forced himself to keep chewing. Who knows when I'll get food again? But he listened. Ashkelon looked into Gideon's eyes, almost into his soul. I find you valuable. If you continue under me, I give you my oath that I will make you into a true hero of the light. I will not rest or stop until you are the finest example of humanity's defenders. You will confront suffering and misery like no other, and stand fast before them. You will do battle with demons of hell and monsters from the abyss, and you will overcome. Gideon stared at him, his cheeks stuffed with apple, and finally asked the question that had been burning a hole in his mind for weeks. Why? Why are you doing all this? Why are you training me? Why do you want a hero so much? Ashkelon crooked a half smile. You would not like that answer. Finally smiling himself, Gideon said, I don't like most of what you say. Answer the question. The sorcerer considered him for a moment before answering. Finally, he said, Because, when at last you stand ready, you shall kill me. Gideon stopped chewing. The world itself fell silent at Ashkelon's words. He spoke around his mouthful of apple. What? Ashkelon sighed and said, Continue eating. I will explain as I can. He seated himself cross-legged on the ground and steepled his fingers before his face, his cold gaze examining Gideon. After a moment, he asked, Why were you in the tower where I found you? Gideon tore a chunk of bread away from the roll and answered, We were there to kill the Crow Father. Ashkelon shook his head. No, that is what you were there to do. I want to know why you were there. Gideon gestured helplessly. Because he was evil. A trait you yourself lack entirely. Grimacing at the dry rebuke, Gideon shook his head. No, I have evil within me. Then what drove you to end his life before taking your own? Or that of another evil warlocks in his place? Gideon looked at Ashkelon blankly, unsure how to respond. Ashkelon sighed. Did he have direct villainous influence upon your life? Was this evil man threatening your family, your lands, your people? After a moment, Gideon shook his head. No, he was not. We came from another region. Leaning forward, Ashkelon transfixed Gideon's gaze with his own. Then why target him? Gideon realized where this was going and winced slightly. Because that is who we were being paid to kill. Ashkelon's eyes glinted with satisfaction, and he leaned back. Exactly. In the place of pure motives, greed. In the stead of justice, profit. Gideon felt distinctly uncomfortable. We took pay, yes, but we destroyed evil when we found it. You mean when it was pointed out to you by a customer with heavy bags of gold? A trifle defensive now, Gideon shot back. Fighting men still need to eat. And you ate considerably better after making a kill. Until necessity drove you to seek another, Ashkelon retorted. Your hungers ruled you, not justice. Gideon opened his mouth, but Ashkelon cut him off. You were not acting the part of a selfless hero, my apprentice. You were a mercenary, a mere sword for hire, an expendable commodity to be bid upon and haggled over. Though possessed of a high personal standard of morality, you compromised it to put food in your mouth. The bread lay heavy in his mouth. Gideon found it difficult to swallow the lump. Finally, he answered. It was the only thing I could find to do. Ashkelon considered him. At last, honesty. Go on. Gideon did not look at him, but I can't speak, but instead stared into the skies. This was the only way I could find to stop evil men from doing what happened to me. The men who recruited me promised to give me armor, enough to eat, and a good war to fight. Ashkelon chuckled. And you believed him. Gideon grimaced. I was younger, and a little more naive. It was a gray area. Ashkelon considered him a moment, and then sighed. A gray area. I cannot tell you how much I hate that phrase. Why? Gideon asked. A gray area assumes that there is a middle ground between darkness and light. Gray is not a color. It is white, dirtied with a small amount of black, and deceived that it is an acceptable compromise. Men say that true purity cannot exist, and therefore gray is more realistic. Gideon shrugged. This is the world we live in. Ashkelon looked at Gideon. I reject this notion. Everything not pure white is just another shade of black. Gideon pointed at him with the heel of his bread. You claim to judge the actions of good men? You? You're responsible for dozens of murders that I have witnessed personally, and all of those were me. Ashkelon's eyes flashed coldly. I know what I have seen. I know what ideals the champions of the light purport to uphold. It is likely that I can recount the names of more heroes who have died by my blade than you have ever heard of. And yet, they were all flawed by darkness in some way. Gideon did not back down. Oh, come on, Master. How can you expect a man, any man, to be perfect? If that were the case, none of us, including you, could measure up. Finally, Ashkelon grunted and turned away. It is too much, perhaps, to ask purity of purpose for the entirety of one's life. A wry smirk creased his face. There is only one, Valantian. Gideon furrowed his brow. Valantian? I don't know that name. You would not. He was not from this world, Ashkelon said, then smiled wryly to himself. You could say, however, that he was my hero. Gideon blinked at that. I'm sorry, your hero? Ashkelon looked back at him, his eyes shining coldly. Imagine a world shrouded in the dark, as billowing clouds of black roil in the sky and strangle all life. Call it sin, if you will, or chaos, or evil. Men light candles or hold torches to hold back its cruel inevitability, but they are fools. When their torches begin to fail, when their candles gutter and flicker in the night, that is when you can see them begin to reason within themselves. They say, my blackness is not as black as the blackness over there. And they claim that they are more righteous, that they are more worthy of honor and praise. Soon their perceptions are governed and dictated by the night around them as they begin to judge the world according to the laws of the blind. Ashkelon sneered. So the people of Avalon huddled together to tend dying fires and congratulated themselves on the sparks they produced, hoping that these pathetic flashes of light would dissuade the gods of murder and that the fangs of the dark would choose someone else. But the dark knows its own. It sees the darkness in man and recognizes it, is drawn to it. There is no gray in the dark. The end of man was nigh. Gideon leaned forward and asked, But? Ashkelon nodded. But Valentian. In the endless fog of the dark, Valentian Assyrius was a blazing star, burning the darkness away wherever he walked. He was granted great gifts by the light, almost searing the eyes of those who beheld him. A tireless champion of good, the scion of Avalon itself. He defied the night and forced it back with sword, shield, and fury, breaking the armies of evil and forcing them to hide in fear. It was because of him that the dark lost its hold on my world. Him and his brother Gemelte. What happened? Gideon asked, crossing his arms across the unnaturally black plates of his armor. Ashkelon answered, The dark found a champion of its own. Ashkelon glanced away, and Gideon saw his eyes grow distant as he remembered. When I arose from the shadows, I took the Avala off guard. I snuffed out their fires one by one and left them to the brutal truth of the night they had deluded themselves into believing no longer existed. In a rage, Valentian came against me and we fought. We fought for years, decades, neither able to overcome the other. He was everything that was honorable and right in man, and I was everything else. The very values of good and evil clashed together, consummating on the peak of my fortress. And you lost. That's why you're here. Gideon took another bite of his food. Because Valentian banished you? Ashkelon sighed. For a moment, Gideon was struck by what seemed to be regret in the sound. That is not wholly accurate. Gideon waited, but Ashkelon left the question unanswered. The mage rose to his feet, his dark cloak swishing, and said, Finish eating and take your rest. You have much to learn, and tomorrow your training begins in earnest. He walked away, leaving Gideon with his food. Gideon stared after him for a moment before muttering to himself, Tomorrow's in earnest? What have we been doing? Drink. I don't know. I'm kind of giving up right now on trying to imitate any actor because I can't keep it consistent. I think I'm just going to properly enunciate with some hatred and see if that doesn't just properly convey what Ashkelon's like. I think maybe one more chapter. I gotta go check my meat after that. Yeah, it's not very long. 4. Warrior. It was the nature of the beast to practice swinging and blocking and moving with a heavy weapon until one's arms burned hot and that weapon trembled from exhaustion. Gideon could remember days past in his mercenary unit when he would collapse on his bedroll, hardly able to pull a blanket over himself, but content with the day's hard work. Ashkelon, however, had taken that good, proper, familiar feeling and elevated it to soul shattering fatigue. Gideon had never been so tired in his entire life. He didn't think anyone had. By his estimation, Gideon had performed more sword drill than a battalion of soldiers. His arms felt like someone had hung lead weights from them and forced him to do 6 hours of sword drill a day for weeks on end. It was appropriate that they felt that way, because that was precisely what happened. Every morning, the mage encased Gideon's arms in a heavy black metal, then instructed him in the sword styles and masteries of dozens of cultures, guiding him through hundreds of ritual movements called forms. Invariably, Gideon could only hold up his arms for the first hour, struggling to learn the flowing styles of long dead monks or the brutal chops of the barbarians of the plains. Then, inevitably, his arms would begin to sag, his technique would falter, and he was reduced to swinging with dead limbs, desperately trying to match Ashkelon's serpentine motions through the complicated forms being demonstrated. Only after Gideon could no longer raise his arms would Ashkelon draw a blade out of smoke and duel him. Gideon staggered backward, desperately heaving his blade two-handed to deflect Ashkelon's flickering sword. The Halcyon family blade just barely caught the edge of Ashkelon's and nudged it just enough to cause it to lop off a lock of Gideon's sweat-drenched hair instead of the entire head. Too exhausted to arrest the weapon's path and withdraw it to a guard, Gideon turned with the blade and launched a heavy horizontal cut at Ashkelon's midsection. I want you guys to know this was my first book, and I am on the fly replacing the word blade because I used it like 18 times in half a page, and it's very frustrating for me to see. Unfortunately for him, Ashkelon had foreseen the attack, which was a surprise to no one, and stepped into the blade's arc. Ashkelon's forearm blocked the hilt, while he sharply punched Gideon across the jaw with the pommel of his weapon, then whipped it back around to rest at Gideon's throat. Gideon sagged, dead. Was probably the 12th time in an hour. The sorcerer pulled the blade back and raised an eyebrow. Do you require rest? Your blade work is suffering. Gideon rubbed his eyes and his shoulder, since he was unable to lift his arms, and cracked his neck. I don't know what you're talking about. I actually hit your sword that time. Ashkelon inclined his head sardonically. So you did. Well done. Gideon blew out his breath and hefted his screaming, metal-encased arms to put his blade on guard. Again, Ashkelon saluted him with his own sword and answered with a slight smile. Again. Nor was the training limited to weapons only. Gideon parried Ashkelon's thrusting spear tip with his sword and ducked the butt end as it lashed out for his head. The sorcerer spun to deliver yet another stab, but his student had stumbled backward out of range. Immediately, Ashkelon lowered the spear. You concede the advantage when you retreat. Disbelieving, Gideon laughed harshly. Did I miss something? I had an advantage? The Onyx mage ignored the sarcasm. You could have closed the distance when my back was turned. Your aggression would have tipped the balance of the fight in your favor. But then you would have done something else and killed me anyway. What does it matter? Ashkelon leveled a chilling glare at him. It matters, because you would have seen my response to your attack. It matters, because you would have learned something new, instead of wasting our time while you willfully ignore the lessons of the past. It matters, because you would have been doing everything in your power to overcome your opponent, rather than conceding momentum because you think yourself a seer of all possible futures. Shamed into silence, Gideon swallowed. Ashkelon did not stop. His words spat from his lips with venom. There are enough threats out there that you will not know how to fight. There will be no drills to help you discover the weakness in your enemy when at last you meet it. You will be confronted by the unknowable, and you will thirst for your blood. At those times of deadly ignorance, all you will have is your indomitable assurance that you will be victorious. Your faith Gideon, formed in these days of tedious reaction to knowable threats. Faith, formed through knowing that every time a weapon sought your life, you reacted with all of your might and wrested the initiative away through sheer force of will. The sorcerer sneered. Do you think you are a hero simply because you wear armor and bear a sword? I have seen heroes kill with rocks, clad in rags, starving and on the edge of death. Against all odds, they advance, striving to further the cause of righteousness for another day. His voice shaking slightly, Ashkelon stepped forward, clenching a fist before him. Heroes believe! Against reason, against evidence, against their instincts, they believe. They know that right will win, even when they know it can't. They are empty vessels filled to the brim with this impossible contradiction. Ashkelon stabbed his finger at Gideon, eyes blazing fiercely. That is how a lone man confronts an army of screaming savages, fitting his last arrow to the string with a laugh contemptuous of death. That is how a doomed rearguard meets their end with a hymn of victory on their lips. When surrounded by the everlasting dark, when the candles of false hope have guttered out, and the fangs of demons glisten wetly with their ageless hunger, the just continue to live by this insane, hopeless, glorious faith. For a second, the two of them remained, eyes locked on one another's, one clad in dirty iron, the other draped in shadow. At last, Ashkelon said, Therefore, it might behoove you to react to these knowable threats with a modicum of that same faith, if you were not willing to be a disappointment to all those who worship the title hero. As Gideon lifted his aching arms and brandished his tarnished sword, the thought came unbidden to his mind. Like you. Ashkelon slung the spear around his head and drew it back, sliding the roughed haft through the curve of his thumb and forefinger of his forward hand, till it rested just below the spearhead, tip angled toward Gideon. Now stop wasting mankind's last moments of life, and fight like you believe. One day I will do a character whose voice does not rasp and doesn't tear my throat to ribbons of meat. Ashkelon's rebuke never left him. His cutting words echoed in Gideon's soul, infecting his dreams, his meals, his prayer. He threw himself into his training, practicing under Ashkelon's merciless gaze and further by himself. His mind, formerly barricaded against the deluge of instruction, opened fully to accept and absorb. He crawled through mud, dragging a casualty with him, as arrows born of magic sliced through the air above him. Dirt and grime darkened his skin, and his muscles ached as he gripped the heavy tree trunk and dragged it a few more inches. He gripped his sheathed family sword by the blade, trying to wrestle with the log one-handed while not dropping the weapon. Gideon had died enough times for that particular sin. It did not matter that the task seemed impossible. Above him, merciless darkness walked, watching. Faster, Ashkelon commanded. Do you not care that this man lies near death? Or is all that praying a facade to hide your true weakness? Gideon gritted his teeth, adjusted his grip, and hauled the log a full foot forward with a groaning snarl, his biceps screaming at the strain. Sweat poured over his face, washing grit into his eyes. Gideon spat a thick wad of spittle into the muck and gathered his legs under him for another push. Only a mile to go. Faster, Ashkelon demanded. It took weeks, months even. Endless pain and drill, followed by endless pain and drill. But Gideon began to suspect something. He suspected he was getting better. Without warning, Ashkelon complicated his drills, including more and more advanced techniques in the routines. Oftentimes, Gideon would stand, muscles taut, ears perked, waiting for Ashkelon to bark out the name of a routine. As soon as he sprang into the lethal movements of that particular form, Ashkelon would change it, forcing Gideon to flow into the alternate form seamlessly. His blade became as familiar to him as his arm. Ashkelon took to stealing Gideon's sword at every opportunity and killing Gideon with it if he succeeded. As a result, Gideon ate with his father's weapon leaning against his knee. He slept with the weapon, curled around the sheath protectively to prevent Ashkelon's theft. He did not so much as relieve himself without the sword on his person. A few weeks passed. Ashkelon began to cheat in their duels. The first time, Gideon deflected a sword thrust and tucked his foot behind him, spinning into a lateral cut that would have torn a normal man in half. I got him this time, flashed through Gideon's mind. But the iron one haft of a melee spear blocked his blade, and Gideon had to recoil from a blitz of flashing thrusts and slashes, desperately defending as Ashkelon assaulted him with an entirely different weapon conjured from the ether. The day before, Ashkelon forced Gideon to spar him blindfolded, then somehow made him weightless. As he thrashed in panic, rising toward the sky, Ashkelon slammed his mailed fist into the side of his head, spinning him about with no hope of halting his momentum. Then the madman restored nature's order, and nature gave Gideon a concussion. It was impossible. It was hopeless. It was really, really fun. Gideon could not help it. He woke up grinning fiercely at the challenges of the day before him, though his body ached as if he had been pressed in a vise. Today, his arms were trapped at his sides with vine from some kind of plant monster from Ashkelon's imagination. He was half blinded and choking from a poisonous pollen burst, and he was fairly sure the thing was trying to eat him, but as he juked and dodged its whipping fronds, Gideon grinned like a fiend. I'm going crazy. He's making me crazy. The thought made his smile bigger. He kicked out at one frond, ducked and rolled under a spray of thorns, which apparently it could also fire at him with a hiss of compressed air, because what plant would be complete without its own supply of compressed air, and came up face to face with the primary pod, a giant pink bulb that had teeth for some ungodly reason. His hands were tied, its plant limbs were about to wrap him up and drain the blood from his twitching body, and what was left of him would probably nourish the thing's little plant babies. Gideon did not hesitate. Ashkelon pressed the poultice of foul-smelling herbs and chemicals to the side of Gideon's face, careful to leave him a nostril to breathe through, and asked, "A headbutt. You decided to strike a Sicarian man-killer with your face." There was about a quarter inch of one of Gideon's lips that could still move. "It seemed like a good idea at the time." Ashkelon placed another poultice across the puffy, warty, blood-red mass that was Gideon's face, and said, "I am going to have to educate you with better ideas. The swelling should go down in about an hour. I will brew you tea to flush the toxins out of your system. You will not enjoy that." "I think I hate is relching." "That would be the man-killer's poison activating your nerve endings. I am told it is a remarkable sensation." "Eh, we should try it." "No, thank you. I am one of those rare individuals who learn from the pain of others." Gideon huffed, the best he could do for a laugh. "There's plenty to learn here." Ashkelon actually smiled. "You did well, my apprentice." "Taught him a lesson he don't forget. This is the world of man." Ashkelon chuckled and patted him on the shoulder. "Take your rest. You will be fighting it again tomorrow." The sound Gideon made blurred the line between a whine and a pitiful cry. Then a huffing sigh, and the warrior said, "Without the head, ideally." Sparks slashed off the halcyon blade as Gideon parried Ashkelon's backhanded attack. Thankfully, the screaming blade remained sheathed and mute on the sorcerer's back. Holy cow, if I use the word blade one more time, oh, there it is. I will be doing a second edition of this book because I can't stand reading it. I hope you're enjoying. Thankfully, the screaming sword remained sheathed and mute on the sorcerer's back, according to Ashkelon. The cursed steel would blast his simple sword into bits of skittering metal. The conjured blade that Ashkelon bore twisted and warped in his hands, becoming a two-handed warhammer arcing toward Gideon's skull. He sidestepped the swing, and the head of the hammer cratered the ground with a thud. Gideon kicked at its head, fouling Ashkelon's retraction of the weapon, and lunged forward, taking advantage of the split second of vulnerability the maneuver had granted him. The Dark Sorcerer met his attack with a squared stance, deftly dodging the first two stabs of Gideon's flickering blade. The Warhammer transformed and split into two short curved swords, deadly in close quarters. Gideon gave him no space. His adopted family's ancient sword lashed out like a viper, forcing Ashkelon to parry with both blades. Gideon rode with the. Why is that not muted? Okay, someone turn that off. New rule. I'm allowed to use the word blade once per page. Gosh, my workout routine was I did a push up for every time I used the word blade. I'd be swole. Gideon rode with the force of the deflection and cut back, his response tearing the swords from Ashkelon's hands. That did not mean Ashkelon was beaten. The memories of the sorcerer's countless hand-to-hand victories added even more speed to his follow-on strike. Gideon roared as he shouldered Ashkelon back and hacked at him, his weight squarely, I can't talk anymore. His weight squarely behind the strike, his sword angled toward Ashkelon's midriff. Unable to dodge the blistering attack, Ashkelon dropped 1 foot back to brace himself and crossed both wrists before his face. Gideon's sword smashed into his black dark mail bracers, and the power behind the strike staggered his master back a single step. 1 step. Time froze, and for just an instant, Gideon's soul exulted in the solitary stumble of Ashkelon before one of his attacks. It was not a dodge, not a tactical retreat designed to fool him into overextending. An honest to God stumble because Gideon had hit the pitiless warlock too hard and too fast for him to recover. Over the heavenly choir singing glory in his soul, he heard the faint sound of history screaming for his attention. Realizing his mistake, Gideon lunged into a kick, but his pitifully short second of triumph had given Ashkelon all the time he needed. Ashkelon shifted to avoid the kick and ducked to drive his mailed fist into Gideon's groin. Gideon doubled over with an explosive groan of pain and betrayal, just in time to meet his master's knee to his forehead. His sword ripped out of his hand, and he found himself staring into Ashkelon's burning eyes, with his own blade gently kissing his throat. I made it halfway down the page before I got a blade that time. Gideon closed his eyes and sighed. I almost had you. The blade left, there it is. The blade left his neck, if that is what you wish to believe. You almost fell. I almost made you fall. Ashkelon grunted in amusement as he returned to Gideon his sword. A single step backward does not a fall make, apprentice. Gideon, there it is again. Gideon took his blade and swung it a few times, loosening his wrist as he retorted. No, you're not taking this away from me. You stumbled back. I saw it. Admit it. Admit it, you miserable, heartless monster. I almost had you that time. Ashkelon smirked and embarked in the slow-paced circle of his apprentice, hands held behind his back. Ah, yes. Almost. I have heard of this concept, of attempting but not attaining one's goal. It must be an acrid experience to have come so close to success, but have it snatched away so cruelly. Even the word itself sounds disappointing. Almost. It leaves such a bitter taste in the mouth, don't you think? Gideon narrowed his eyes. You're mocking me. The smirk widened to a teeth-baring smile, which on Ashkelon looked disturbingly reminiscent of a wolf's snarl. Then I suppose, if I were in your situation, I would take my almost and improve it to a performance worthy of more than a miserable, heartless monster's mockery. The rush of anger energized Gideon. His sword hand rotated once more, and a grin broke out on his face as Gideon realized he wanted nothing more in that instant than to wipe that smug smirk off that insufferable pale face. A low growl of pleasure escaped his gritted teeth, and Ashkelon's eyebrow arched. Lowering himself to a fighting stance, the sorcerer hissed. There he is. There's the warrior I wish to see. Gideon cracked his neck, still grinning. I hope you're ready, master. You're going to eat dirt in a few seconds. Words. Sparks sprayed into the hard ground as the blades of mercy and murder clashed once more. I think there's only one blade on this page. Progress. The chill crept in that night with icy fingers. Ashkelon seemed immune to its touch while Gideon lay on the ground, shivering. The sorcerer was seated cross-legged, facing away from him, elbows on his knees, as he held his bared sword at eye level. Nope. The blade parallel to the ground. Ashkelon stared at the weapon as it screamed back into his face. Gideon wrapped his thin blanket tighter around his body and tried to block out the choir of the damned. Yet Ashkelon's seated figure occupied Gideon's thoughts, robbing him of rest. His mother had spoken of men like this. Soldiers get hurt, she had said. And most of the time, you can't see where the wound lies. It stays with them for the rest of their lives. It was the same every night. Gideon would collapse onto the ground, half dead with exhaustion, and Ashkelon would draw his sword and hold it before him, meditating upon the screams. His black half-mask would coalesce from the smoke and conceal his features, masking his thoughts as his ice-blue eyes searched his blade. What makes such a man? Who was he, Father, before he became this? A heavy sigh escaped Gideon. Praying? He rolled over at the sound of Ashkelon's voice. The sorcerer had spoken over his shoulder, his eyes never breaking their gaze upon his blade. How'd you guess? Gideon asked. A grunt of amusement. Some of my experiments sighed as they prayed. I used to annotate the sounds human beings made as they passed through various stages of despair. It may interest you that it would seem no one was listening. Faint contempt put an edge in his tone. Gideon propped his elbow under him as he regarded the dark warrior before him. You don't believe in God. Ashkelon remained still, his back betraying nothing of his thoughts to his apprentice, as choirs of the lost shrieked in his hands. At length, he asked, Do you know what this blade is? Gideon did not answer. His master required no response from him for these tales. Ashkelon continued, his eyes locked on the killing edge of his weapon. The master swordsmiths of the Avala were peerless in their craft before the dark took them. They forged marvels of engineering and science, placing the dominion of Avalon firmly within the hands of men. But in all their number, only the starsmiths truly created. Each one apprenticed for 30 years before forging his first sword. As a recruit, he would swear an oath on the day of his apprenticeship to serve the starsmiths with his life, whether he passed or failed. The attrition among the candidates baffles the mind. Only 1 in 100 might pass his master's scrutiny over 3 decades of training. The rest were cast out, relegated to menial servants or common blacksmiths, enslaved, the losers in the ultimate gamble. Ashkelon's voice dropped to a whisper. But if a man succeeded, Gideon, if he was deemed worthy by the masters, he, on the final day of his apprenticeship, could approach the anvil of Avala and there offer himself as a living sacrifice. A winged spirit would appear before him and ram the burning blade of Eden into his belly. The heavenly fire would boil his blood as it scoured him, testing his purity. If the candidate survived his trial, and most did not, if he were deemed pure by the celestial being, the spirit would gift him with a secret from above, with which he could forge a single sword. Gideon blinked. One sword? Ashkelon closed his eyes and a small smile tugged at his lips. Only one. The love of his life. The swordsmith, filled with the flame of Eden, would work upon the anvil of Avala, under the watch of the mighty spirit, spurning food, water, and rest, until his masterpiece lay completed before him. They called their creations star swords. Tempest Wing, Sun Spire, Drake Splitter. each blade the only one of its kind in the universe. Swords of surpassing beauty, crafted with celestial gold and gems from the deepest reaches of the earth. They had souls, Gideon. As such, they were without price. The Starsmiths gifted them as they willed, to the individual or bloodline they believed most worthy of their life's work. This was no small gift. The bearer of a star sword could pierce the minds of men and know their hearts better than they did themselves. The bearer of a star sword saw the future of kingdoms, the secrets of emperors, and the very will of God. Kings impoverished their own nations for the merest chance of possessing such a weapon. They often sent the strongest of their sons to apprentice to the Starsmiths, hoping against reason that one might overcome the trials and grant their line a star sword. As Ashkelon spun his tale, images swam before Gideon's eyes, almost as if the sorcerer weaved the story into physical form with nothing but his words. It riveted him in place. Ashkelon went on. The last to ascend the stairway was called Acheron. He was the last to speak to the winged spirit, and the last to use the fabled anvil of Avala. He was a musician, his soul vibrating with the music of the spheres, and the spirit took his passion as material for the blade. Under its tutelage, he forged a star sword, yes, but also a window to heaven itself. The music of the celestial city flowed from the blade, capturing the wills of the hearers. They called it Hamdalithian, the Song of Heaven. His story paused. Ashkelon's forehead creased, almost as if in pain, as Gideon watched a featureless man bearing a blazing sword step before a crowd, all of whom, without exception, tumbled to their knees before him, entranced by its song. But Acheron, witnessing his sword's power, became covetous. They say that his soul blackened in that moment, when all bowed before him, and he declared that no other deserved a blade from the winged spirit. He demanded that they build a temple to house the blade, and with a few short weeks, Acheron installed himself as the high priest of the shrine of the Star Sword. With the Star Sword's power, wealth flowed into Acheron's coffers. He married a princess from every realm, tying them all to his newborn cult. The kingdoms fell into idolatry, as Acheron commanded them to worship the star sword he had created. His demands grew more and more costly, as his lust for power and wealth grew, until at last, men rebelled. The images swirled, resolving into a council of kings, pointing at a robed man with a staff of office and a tall mitre. Faint accusations echoed until the robed man brandished the sword, his face contorted with rage. Acheron declared that the Star Sword was angry, that it had seen their treacherous hearts, and spoken to him of it. He swore to slay every king in turn till the traitors were found. He raised his sword to kill, but the entrance of a stranger stayed him. A hooded man in beggar's robes and a gnarled walking stick stepped between the furious priest and the cowering kings, hand raised gently. With a quiet yet firm voice, he condemned Acheron for making the gift of heaven into an idol, daring to state that Acheron had proved himself unworthy of the rank of Starsmith. Before Acheron could strike him down, the stranger offered a contest. If he could prove that Acheron's heart was black with evil, Acheron must surrender the blade to him. With a laugh of scorn, Acheron rashly accepted. I have a crying baby, and I don't hear my wife, so I'm going to end here. You guys can read the rest on your own. There's like 2 pages left. So I'll be right back.